Hey, how's it going everyone? It's Lee Halliday, and in this video we're going to add Firebase authentication to a React app, and we're going to do it both with email password, but we're also going to create our own GitHub application so we can add GitHub Connect to it. So to get started, we're in the Firebase console and we're going to create a new application. So what we're going to build is something called Just Shameful, where eventually we're going to create an app to store gists, just like you can do on GitHub. So we're going to click Continue. I don't want Google Analytics for this project, but we're going to click Create, and we'll just wait 30 seconds or so for it to generate this new project. When it finishes setting up the project, we're going to click Continue, and it's going to drop us here on this dashboard, but we're going to first click into Authentication. And we want to enable a couple different types of authentication like I mentioned. So click Get Started, and then we're going to enable both the email password. So we'll just click Enable on that. And then we're going to go down to GitHub and we are going to enable it as well. Now in order to enable it, you need to provide a client ID and a client secret. And in order to do that, you're going to have to copy this. So I'm going to hop over to GitHub for a second. And inside of your user settings, right down here at the bottom, you've got developer settings, Auth apps, and we're going to register a new application. So I've created this before when I was practicing, and you can't call it Just Shameful because it won't let you use just as the name of yours, because I guess that's something they have. So we're going to say this is Just Shameful, and it's hosted at the prestigious localhost 3000, and then we paste in our callback URL here, and then we can register this application. So that gives us two things. First is the client ID, which we have to copy back over into Firebase. And then we need a new secret. So we're going to click, once we confirm our password, we're going to click that, and that will give us a secret that we can copy and come over here and paste here. So with that good, we can click Save, and now our auth is set up in both email password and GitHub. So now what we're going to do is go into the project settings, and this will expose two things that we need. The first is the project ID, which we're going to copy and paste. So now it's time to hop over to the code. So I am doing this in Next.js, but this doesn't really have anything to do with Next.js. It should work similarly in Gatsby, in Create React App, in whatever you're sort of using. And I'm going to go into a .env.local file, which is not committed. And that's where I'm storing these two environment variables that I need. So the first one was the project ID, Just Shameful, that I'm going to paste in. And then I also need this web API key as well. So I'm going to paste that as well. So these are publicly available. They're not secrets, but that's why they have the name next_public, so that Next.js will build this into the Webpack build. So we're done with this. We can close that out, and I'm just going to restart the Next.js app so that it picks up the new environment variables. And then we can see what this app's doing so far. So if we were to go to the web and load the page, this is what you see, just a login link. And let's take a look at the code that's building this. So I am on the pages index.tsx, the home page. And right now everything's just sort of faked out. So what I've got at the top are a few different variables: user, loading, and the ability to log out, which is right now just hard-coded. We'll replace that with our own values coming from an auth provider that we'll create. And then we're just handling the different scenarios. If it's loading, we're just going to show nothing for now. You could show a spinner or whatnot, but Firebase Auth takes a sec to sort of know whether you're authenticated or not. So this is that loading state. So if there's not a user, what do you want to do? For now, I just showed a login button, but once we build this out, we're going to then show the ability to enter your email password or GitHub Connect in here. Then we come down here, and at this point, we're authenticated. So I have a logout button. When clicked, calls the logout function that right now does nothing, but that's what we're going to try to do. So this is what we're working with. And to get started, we're going to go into a file that I've already sort of created the skeleton of in this repo src init Firebase. And at the top of this file, we've got a few different imports. We're importing Firebase from Firebase App. You always need this, and then you can sort of add in your different imports for the different aspects of Firebase you're using. We're using Auth today, but this is sort of the beginning of an app where we're going to build that gist, the ability to add gists and edit them and whatnot using the Firebase real-time database. So I have this here. We're not using it right now. But we've got a whole bunch of configs. So the API key, this comes from our environment variable. Our auth domain, it's the project ID and then .firebaseapp.com. We're not using this, but this would be our database URL. And then we've got our project ID itself. So in here, our goal is to initialize Firebase. And to do that, we're going to create a function. So function, and it's going to be called init Firebase, very original. And in it, what we're going to do is basically check if Firebase has already been initialized. So we do that by saying if not firebase.apps.length, because we just want one Firebase app in this project that we're working with. So if this is not the case, that means we can initialize it. So we say firebase.initialize app, and we pass in that config object that I had up here. So what we're going to do is actually just call it right away. If anyone imports this file, boom, that's our signal to initialize Firebase. And then what we're going to do is export the Firebase object so that the rest of the app can sort of import this and use it. Now, if at this point it looks very similar to things I've done in another Firebase video or my Next.js course, that's because it is. So it will be a little bit of review, but this time we're adding GitHub Connect if you're already familiar with that. And if you're interested in my Next.js course, where we build out a full stack Next.js app with Firebase Auth, with Prisma, with GraphQL, with Apollo client and server, with maps, all of that stuff, there'll be a link below. Please check it out. Something I'm very proud of. So continuing on, we've initialized Firebase. And what we're going to do now is move over and basically create an auth provider. So this will be done inside of src auth provider. I've got a few imports here, and we can now uncomment the import Firebase from init Firebase. But it's our job to basically build out the rest of a provider. And what does a provider do? It basically provides data via a context to the rest of your application. So it's something that wraps itself around the rest of your components, and then they can grab data from it. So what data are we storing here? It's data about our authenticated user. So the app can know, is there a user? How do I log out for that user? Things like that. So we're going to start, since we're in TypeScript, by defining an interface that will basically represent the data that's stored inside of our context. So this is called iContext. And we're going to have three pieces of information. The first is the user. And the type for this user comes from Firebase, and it's firebase.user, or null, because if the user is unauthenticated, there's no value here. Loading is going to be a Boolean, and then logout will be a function that we don't really care about the return result, so void. So if this looks very similar to the data that I had mocked out in our home page, it's because it's the exact same. That's the data that our auth provider is going to provide to the rest of our application. So with the context defined, the interface of that context defined, we're going to initialize the context itself. So to do that, we're going to say Auth Context is equal to, and we're going to call a function from React, create context. To it, we can pass the type of data that's going to be stored in our context. And then we pass the default values. So our context, the user is going to begin null, and the loading will be true until it's sort of toggled to false. And then the logout, for now, is just going to be an empty arrow function that will later override with the real one. So this is our context, but a context on its own isn't super useful. It sort of needs to be combined with a provider that will wrap itself around and provide this context to the rest of our application. So we're going to create our auth provider right here that will basically use this context so that it can give the data to the rest of our app. So here we've got auth provider. This is going to be a function component. So this is just a normal React component, a function one. And it is going to, let me just write out this component here. It's going to receive some props, just one actually, and it's going to receive the children. So as it's wrapping itself around your app, the ones that are inside, those are the children. And then it's our job to basically fill out the rest of this component here. So the first thing we're going to do is just to declare some state, some data that we're going to store in our auth provider. So here we've got the user and the ability to change the user. And this is going to be state. We're going to provide the TypeScript types. So the user is firebase.user or null, the same type as up here. And remember, its initial value will be null. And we're also going to track whether it's loading or not. So loading, set loading is going to be a Boolean value, and it's going to default to true, just like that. So with these two values set up, we're going to come down here and we're going to return. And inside our auth provider, we are going to use the auth context, and it has something called a provider. And it's going to wrap itself around the rest of our app, whatever we put this around. But the provider on its own, what data is it going to provide? We need to tell it, and you do that via the value prop. So what we're going to provide to the rest of our app is the user, the one we put in state right here, which is for now null. We're going to provide loading, and then the ability to log out. And log out, the way you do that in Firebase, so it's going to be a function that's called, and we call Firebase.auth is a function, we call it, and then we call the sign out function, just like that. Sweet. So we could at this point go and wrap it around the rest of our app, but we're sort of missing a key part, and it's like Firebase telling us who the authenticated user is. And what we're going to do for this is inside of a useEffect hook, so useEffect, define our function and our dependencies. We don't have any right here. Basically, once on the initial page load, fire this effect. And what we're going to do in here is basically listen for Firebase to tell us who the authenticated user is. So we need to put something in a variable, and that is going to be the ability to cancel listening to who is authenticated. But in here we say firebase.auth, call that function again, same as we did down here. And we are going to call onID token changed. Now this is an event that happens once on page load, where Firebase will tell you whether the user is authenticated or not. And then anytime that changes, so anytime they log out, anytime they log in, this is going to fire, and basically it will contain the user or null if they're not authenticated anymore. So this will receive U to represent the user. And then inside of this function here, I didn't call it user because I have a variable here called user, just to not mix them up. So U, if you hover, it's either Firebase user or null, which is perfect because that's what our state is set up to hold, and that's what our context is set up to provide to the rest of our app. So what we can do is we can say set user to be whatever U is, and we can also say set loading to false, because at this point we know for sure that Firebase has at least fired that first event to let us know whether the user is authenticated or not. So this here gives us back a function we can call when we no longer want to listen for auth changes. When would we want to do that? Basically when our application unmounts. So where you do the cleanup work inside of a useEffect is you actually return a function that's called. And in this return function, we are simply going to call cancel auth listener, just like this. So when the app unmounts, let's stop listening to this. Sweet. So what we've got here is our auth provider. We need to export it. So we'll just copy that and put it down here. And now we have the ability to wrap itself around the rest of our app. So in Next.js, typically you would do that in pages_app. It's a special component that's sort of wrapping itself around every page. This would be different if you're in Gatsby or create React app, but put it up as high as you can in your component tree. So what we're going to do is we're going to import auth provider from src auth provider. And then what we can do is wrap this around this component here, and this component represents every page of our Next.js app. So nothing really should have changed yet, but now we do have the context available to us. And to make that a little bit easier to go and access the values in our context, what we're going to do is go and create a little custom hook that's really just sort of, the function will be one line, and it's function use auth, and it's going to return basically the value of our context. So we're going to return the used context hook of our auth context. So you'll see how to use this in a second. But think of this basically is whenever you use it, you're going to get access to these three values: user, loading, and logout. So with that auth provider set up, we're now going to go back to our home page, and we're going to replace this hard-coded business here with, once I import the use auth custom hook that I just created, we are going to use auth. And remember, this gives us back the user, whether it's loading or not, and logout. Exactly what we needed to make this page function. So we're not logged in yet. We need the ability to do that. So it's time to go and create a login page. So what I want to do there is basically import Firebase Auth, which is going to represent the login sort of form. And it won't work yet because we haven't created it, but what we're going to do is basically replace this dummy login button with a call to the Firebase Auth component, or that's what we're going to return anyways. TypeScript is freaking out. We haven't exported Firebase Auth yet, so let's go and create that. So in src Firebase Auth, over here, I've got a few things set up already. I've got some imports set up, some things from React itself. I've got this styled Firebase Auth. So this is sort of an auth page in a box. It looks nice, it's easy to use, and it already works really well with Firebase Auth. So we're going to utilize that, and we need to import our Firebase app. This is probably not required because we already imported it here when we initialized it, but I guess it's just to be safe. And I've already set up our config, so you don't have to see me type all of this out. So the sign-in flow we're going to use is pop-up. You'll see what it looks like in a second. The options we have available to us are two. So the first one was the email auth provider, and we're not requiring a display name, just email password. Our second one is the GitHub auth provider, and when the user signs in successfully, we're going to take them to the home page. But basically our job here was to create a component called Firebase Auth that will render the ability to log in. So what we're going to do is we're going to say const Firebase Auth. It is a function component like this, and it will be a function because it's a function component. And inside of here, we want to return, I'm going to put it in a div, but that's probably not necessary. What we're going to do is basically use the styled Firebase Auth component. So styled Firebase Auth like this. It's self-closing, and to this we need to pass some props. So the first prop is basically this config that I had set up. So this is done under UI config, and that is equal to Firebase Auth config like this. And we also have to pass basically an instance of Firebase Auth so that it can use it inside of its component. So that is Firebase Auth, and we'll access that by using this Firebase here. Now, why don't I actually just replace this by saying import Firebase from src init Firebase, since we sort of already set this up. And now we can come down here and say Firebase.auth. So provide auth to this component. Let me just refresh to get rid of that error. Oh, we created it, we never exported it, so export default Firebase auth, like that. Sweet. There we go. So if I go into the source, I've seen an issue that has to do with SSR, server-side rendering in Next.js. If I refresh, we'll see if we get it. No, maybe it's down here. No. Anyways, I'm going to solve it even though I'm not seeing the error come up. But sometimes what happens is this should only be rendered client-side. So this will not work in server-side rendering. And the way to sort of solve for that is, I actually just remembered why it isn't happening, but it's because our code here is returning null when it's loading. It's always loading server side. But that aside, we're going to solve this here. It's a nice little trick if you ever need it. If you ever need something to only render client side, there's a way you can do it using useEffect. So what we're going to say is basically a variable called show, and we'll say set show, and we'll say use state false. So it's going to start off as false, and we're going to say only show this if show and render that. So right now it's not rendering, right? Because show is false. So how do we toggle this to true? Well, we can use useEffect to basically, once on page load, we'll call set show to true. So why does this solve the issue? It solves it because useEffect happens after the initial render, would basically updating the state, causing it to re-render, and useEffect only happens in the client. So on the server, we never really have to worry about this useEffect running, triggering a re-render. That won't happen. So we're good to go. It solves sort of the issue of not wanting to render this on the server. And if you're wondering why we didn't have the error I was expecting to receive, it's because in Auth Provider over here, we've got this loading, which sort of only gets set to false in this case within a useEffect. So it's the same sort of thing where useEffect is only happening on the client, and that's why we weren't actually showing this auth page. But back to the story. Okay, with Firebase Auth component set up, it's now rendering styled Firebase Auth, only show when show is true, which happens via the useEffect on the client. But if we were to come back here now, just close this, we have two options. We can sign in via email, so we can do that. Just put in my email, my top secret password, and that will authenticate me. So right away we know we're authenticated because we have the logout button. So if we go back to our home page, when do we show the logout button? We show it when it's not loading, so it's initialized, and if there weren't a user, we would show the Firebase Auth page, but there is, so we come down here and we're showing the logout button. So we've essentially completed adding Firebase Auth to our React app. I can click logout, which calls this logout function, which in our auth provider tells Firebase to log out, to sign out. That would trigger the onID token changed, which updates our user to null, which would cause a re-render of this page now with a user being null. So there was a lot of stuff that happened all together to see now that we can log in again. So I'll show you GitHub. This is the pop-up that you're seeing. That's when it was showing, do I use the pop-up UI or not? So we're going to authorize ourselves to use this app. Oh, interesting. Firebase is smart. Because my GitHub uses leehalliday@gmail.com, and so did I for my when I did the email password sign in, it's asking me to basically link these, and the only way I can do that is by re-entering my password. So it basically uses the email as the, I guess, the unique key for this user. But now once I do that once, it shouldn't force me to do it again. Yeah, it's only on the first time when you've never sort of joined those two different authentication methods together. So that's it. I guess it was quite a bit, but we went from nothing to a fully functioning Firebase Auth setup in, I don't know, whatever that was, half an hour. Hope you enjoyed this video. If you're still here, I would appreciate if you could subscribe to my channel, give this video a like, all the standard stuff. And as I mentioned before, check out my next level Next.js course. It's $50. If you're not from a place where that price is reasonable, just send me a message and I'll give you a coupon code to help out with that. But yeah, please check it out. Have a great day. Take care. Bye.